Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Michael Stewart. I am the Director of Education here at the OI Foundation. I want to thank you all for coming today to the OI Foundation's second COVID-19 vaccine Q&A session. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. Before that, I want to go over some sort of rules of the road as we move forward. You're going to notice that we have kept your microphones muted for this Zoom meeting. That's just so that we can better hear the speakers and make it so that we can best hear the information they're giving and make everything run smoothly and closer to being on time. Also, I want to give everyone a heads up that if you would like live subtitles of the session, you can go to live transcript in Zoom and then go to show subtitles. We are using an automated service for that for today. Also, if you have questions at any point throughout the session, feel free to type them into the chat. When we put into the original emails a space to put questions, we have received an overwhelming amount of audience questions. So we unfortunately don't have enough time to answer all of them, but we tried to pick ones that were indicative of large trends, and we'll do our absolute best to answer as many questions as we can during today's session. So we thank your patience on that. And with that being said, I'm going to quickly just reintroduce our speakers. These are the same speakers we had on our first vaccine Q&A on December 3rd. So first we have Dr. Brendan Lee, who is at Baylor College of Medicine, who is also on the OIF's Medical Advisory Council. We also have Dr. Robert Sandhouse, who's at Jewish National Medicine. Did I say that right?
National Jewish.
Oh, National Jewish, sorry. In Denver, Colorado, and he is a pulmonologist who particularly studies rare diseases, in particular OI. And then also our speaker for today is Dr. Maria Ilana Bottazzi. She is a world-renowned vaccinologist and also the dean of the dean of the School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. And we are very thankful and happy to have her with us today. So with that being said, I think we want to get straight into the session. So for today's session for everyone, we're going to have a short presentation by Dr. Bottazzi. He's going to be talking about some of the most recent updates in the COVID-19 vaccines. Then we're going to go to a prepared Q&A section where we are trying to answer the questions you have already sent in to us. So with that being said, Dr. Bottazzi, we're going to give you the microphone. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And it's definitely a great pleasure to be back. I think a lot has happened between December and February. It sort of feels a little bit as an eternity, but as you can see, things move very, very quickly. So I just want to put a little bit of framework of where we are at in knowledge and understanding so that it also can facilitate a little bit better the questions that you may have. Very pleased to be with my co-colleagues in trying to answer some of your questions. So I wanted to start again by recapping maybe what I think we're trying to make sure it's a little bit clear, because I think there's been a lot of maybe the misunderstanding that even though indeed we have had some development timelines with regards to the COVID-19 vaccines, which are not really business as usual, it's not necessarily that it means that we have been doing COVID-19 vaccines from scratch. And the fact that indeed we may have done them in a year, but we, in fact, have been working on developing vaccines for these type of viruses for more than a couple of decades. So this slide, I wanted just to reiterate to all of you that even though we may have indeed some things that have accelerated the timelines, first and foremost, no steps were skipped. No less quality or less rigorous of the process of the development of vaccines at the level of production, and therefore the quality of the product, as well as the type of studies that we do to evaluate, of course, safety and efficacy. And the real basis for it is, again, the fact that, first of all, we know about coronaviruses for many, many years. In fact, there are even coronaviruses that circulate in humans that cause common cold. True that there are coronaviruses that live in the animal kingdom, and when some of these viruses have this ability of jumping from an animal to a human and then eventually jumping from human to human, are these so-called coronaviruses that cause outbreaks, and in this case, even epidemics, and with COVID-19 virus, even a pandemic. And so the prior other outbreaks, those that were caused by two coronaviruses, the SARS coronavirus and the MERS coronavirus, especially the SARS coronavirus, which is very similar to the current coronavirus that causes COVID-19, really gave us so much knowledge that we already, for example, knew exactly the structure of the virus. And upon knowing its sequence, we know that the spike protein is one of these molecules that the virus uses that are essential for the virus to, of course, infect our bodies and eventually get inside our cells and trigger all sorts of things that indeed lead to disease. We also, in fact, found the sequence very quickly. If you even compare back in the early 2000s, when we first recognized the SARS virus, it took months before we even identified its genetic code compared to when we were able to even identify the sequence of the SARS-2 very quickly. And the fact that it's from this very similar family, from the SARS-like families, certainly us we've been developing coronavirus vaccines, we already knew not only what to target and how to rapidly deploy the construction or the prototyping of the coronavirus vaccine candidates. In addition, throughout the last couple of decades, if not even more, we have already been studying other technology platforms. So when you hear that, true, we have never had an RNA vaccine licensed before, and indeed, we have even not ever having an adenovirus-based vaccine license before. That doesn't mean that we have not been studying RNA vaccines or adenovirus-based vaccines before. In fact, we have had many studies using these technologies for other infectious diseases, including Zika, including rabies, and many other infectious diseases. And that also, even though it wasn't really advanced for coronaviruses to the point of authorization, it's also that it's not like all of a sudden these technologies appeared out of nowhere. So as you can see, not only the knowledge, the ability of having multiple potential platforms to produce such vaccines contributed, of course, to the timeline. Then we incorporate the fact that you may even ask, so if we indeed knew about coronaviruses before and even had technologies before, why didn't we even have a vaccine before, for any other coronavirus? And the reality is that there are certain studies to really reach to the point where, of course, you can get approval for the vaccines, unless you, of course, have virus circulating in the community. And we know that we were actually quite efficient at using the concept of detecting and containing and therefore dissipating the outbreak when we had SARS and MERS, because we could contain it. It was, of course, not as transmittable, the virus. So even though it was very killing, the viruses were killing a lot of people, they were not being transmitted so widely. And I think when we lost the ability of containing the virus in our communities, it, however, opened up the opportunity where the clinical trials and the designs of the studies that we ended up doing in humans, which, as I believe you've heard, that we've had done studies in multi-cities, multi-countries with greater than 40,000 plus in a given trial. It's the reason that we could do them because we could rapidly identify how well the safety and the efficacy of vaccines would be, because we actually know that we had the people that would be able to be pretty much encounter the virus, the natural virus infection. And that's why, therefore, we could, even after they started these large phase 3 trials, very rapidly, the companies were able to determine the ability of clinical protection, which, remember, the vaccines are to detect the vaccine preventing severe clinical symptoms. And we can go a little bit more into that later. In addition, I have to say, as a vaccine developer and vaccine developer in the area of infectious diseases, I don't think we have ever seen so much money certainly contributed towards this endeavor. And not only money from the US, of course, money by the companies, and certainly money by many multinationals and even global agencies. In the US, we've been quite privileged, because even if you compare how much money we have invested in the government, and even our own tax dollars have invested into this, was really one of the levers to allow the companies to not necessarily even wait to hear and see data that confirmed that the vaccines were working and they were safe. They actually were already working behind the scenes, doing very large amounts of what we call production and advancing this production, even if maybe they would have to lose that investment because, in case these vaccines didn't work. I think we ultimately were very lucky that combining all of these and the fact that we already knew that the spike was really the good target, now we're seeing that pretty much all vaccines have, for the most part, advanced favorably. And in fact, we're going to probably have many, many other options of what other vaccines we could potentially even bring in as available, as the time goes by throughout, certainly 2021 and beyond. And in addition, of course, because it's an emergency, many of us and many of our experts, especially FDA and safety boards, really put very dedicated set of teams to be able to address any kind of data evaluation or information, such that also we didn't stop advancing, of course, other vaccines or drugs or diagnostics that still we need to advance in the midst of a pandemic. So I am a scientist, and I have to show you something that looks like we're certainly scientists. And so I wanted to just give you this depiction in a cartoon fashion of more or less what we mean by the spike protein, and why the spike protein is the key target to use as a vaccine candidate. So first of all, on your left, you have the cartoon of what I believe you probably have seen 100,000 times now, a coronavirus looks like. And it's the fact that it's called corona because it gives this appearance of having a kind of like a crown around it. And I want to put your attention to that little kind of like squared area, which is that little ball that sticks out of it with that line, and that's depicted in the first cartoon, which the blue area is the line, and then the green is kind of like that little ball. And even if you expand on that little, I'm going to call it a green ball, this is a piece that it's of the spike protein that it's called the receptor binding domain of the spike protein. And if you look at what happens sort of three-dimensionally, and what in theory happens when the virus enters into our body, is that spike protein and that green blob is the one that really is the dock to our receptor in our cells. So the ACE2 here, which is this blue and orange, is in our lung cells and many other cells. And when you actually have this binding of the green ball to the receptor in our body, a lot of things happen, and eventually the virus, the entire virus, gets kind of sucked into our cells, and that's where the virus basically takes up an opportunity, uses our machinery, uses our ability of replicating, and the virus multiplies, and of course then bursts the cells, and other cells are infected, and eventually that's what causes the disease. So when we want to block using a vaccine, is we want our immune system, which is also a combination of different factors. We have antibodies that pretty much would come and block that interaction. So it kind of, goes in between the green and the blue. Or we have other types of cells that come, and other kind of cytokines you've heard, and other factors. And that's the premise of the vaccine, right? We actually give, we give something to our body to make it think that they're already seeing that green ball, or at least, the blue and the green. And we prepare our body such that when we actually receive the real virus, we already know to recognize that green ball, and we know this is something that I know I don't like, and therefore already automatically has all the machinery to block this interaction and entry into our cells. So vaccine 101, I hope that, scientifically, this is as much as you're gonna get of the hardcore vaccine. Now, one thing that I know a lot of you would like to know is the fact that for us to make that green ball, or for us to make sure that the body sees that green ball that we mimic from the virus, there's many ways of doing this. So I'm going to focus a minute on the RNA vaccine. So the RNA vaccine means that in the laboratory, I can actually use the code of that green dot, or the blue and green dot, and I actually give the body, and I say, use that code and make me that protein. So if you remember basic biology, you go from a DNA code, the DNA converts into an RNA code, and the RNA code becomes a protein. And the protein really is what our immune system sees and eventually mounts our immune response. So when we give an RNA vaccine, we tell our body, here's an RNA code, make it into a protein, and then the protein is the one that actually induces the response. There is no way that the RNA goes backwards and becomes a DNA. And once the RNA became a protein, there's no more RNA. It's actually a very quick process. But the response that we get is on the protein that is made by the RNA. I'm going to skip for a second the live attenuated and inactivated, because I want to jump over to the last square or column, and it's the viral vector type of vaccines. So the viral vector type of vaccines, what we do is we try to mimic the virus, but instead of using a pathogenic virus, we actually use a virus that we know in humans doesn't cause any disease. And these are these viruses called adenoviruses. We encounter adenoviruses all the time. Most likely, we all have been exposed to adenoviruses. And what we do is in the laboratory, we replace the code, and we actually insert the code for the spike, or that green ball. And then we give it to our body as a mock vector or a mock virus that we know is not going to cause us any disease. And again, once the virus is entering into our cells, the virus cannot actually replicate. In fact, the virus just dies, but we already make the virus produce this protein, and then it's the same process. And ultimately, when we give protein vaccines, we sort of bypass, meaning we don't give a virus that then needs to make the protein. We don't give a code that then makes the protein. We give you the protein directly, right? So these are primarily the three types of vaccines that are within the vaccines that we are going to be developing in the US. That doesn't mean that maybe in the future, we may also receive some of the live attenuated or inactivated. And these are actually real coronaviruses that we modify in the lab by inactivating or attenuating and removing all the pathogenesis. Right now, only some of the Chinese vaccines use these processes, but in the US, we are primarily evaluating RNA, subunit, and viral vector. And here's the landscape of the US right now. So we already know we have 2 authorized vaccines, both based on the concept of RNA. We have a second wave of vaccines, and these include 2 vaccines that use this concept of the adenovirus, plus a vaccine that is based on a protein subunit. But we also had a few third waves that, for example, Sanofi, which was going to advance another type of protein vaccine. they actually have delayed their, I guess, program. And in fact, right now they said, because we are delayed, we're going to come and help Pfizer, because they also know how to make RNA vaccines. So they partner with Pfizer to, in fact, help produce more. And in fact, we have another company who was using another type of viral vector, not an adenovirus. They were using another type of non-pathogenic virus, but they found that, in fact, their vector was not very efficient, and in fact, they discontinued. And there is a likelihood that Merck, because it is also a pretty prominent vaccine company, may also come and start helping some of the other to see if they could maybe even help in production or even support some of this endeavor. So these indeed are there for the vaccines that we have in play. I highlighted the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because, oh, and before I actually go to that, I'll tell you about the Johnson & Johnson, mostly because it's the one that most likely is going to get approved very shortly. But first of all, I just wanted to also highlight to you all that the RNA2 vaccines, and this is a site of the CDC that actually tracks the number of vaccines that have been administered in the US. And this is a combination of people who have received either one dose or possibly even 2 doses. And in context of true that we are more than 300 million people in the US, and that if you take out all those who are less than 16 years of age, you know, this is quite a substantial number already, at least of the number of vaccines. So if you ask me about, are they safe and are they going to be causing something that it's absolutely, you know, terrible? There's already almost 50 million people that have received these vaccines. And I can also assure you that if you look at how much it has been certainly reported of any events or adverse events, very, 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 very low level of severe adverse events. The other thing that I also, before I go into telling you a little bit about what's happening in with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, is that you have to remember that the vaccine performance that was evaluated was specifically to attempt to reduce the symptomatic infection. So these vaccines, the intent was to see if they could protect against any symptoms, whether they were mild, severe, or certainly moderate. Ideally, of course, with the intent that if they were to protect us, we also wanted to make sure that it didn't have very good protection by preventing enough symptoms that people don't necessarily have to go to the hospital. Certainly prevent symptoms that even if you do go to the hospital, you do not get in intensive care units, and certainly that you don't end up dying. And so that doesn't mean that this vaccine may also have an impact on those who are asymptomatic, and maybe what it's doing, it's reducing the amount of infectious virus or even virus that can be transmitted, but we still do not know 100% how much it can reduce the infection and how much, in fact, it can reduce you being infectious even after getting the vaccine and encountering the virus. And this is important because I know many of you ask, well, if I get the vaccine, why do I have to still use masks? And why do I still have to distance? And there's a couple of reasons why, but one of the most important reasons is because you are protecting yourself against symptoms, but you not necessarily mean that you're not going to get actually infected. And more importantly, that you may still be transmitting the virus. So before again I go into the Johnson & Johnson, I also want to remind you that it's very important that when you do get the vaccine, and in fact, even for those 50 million people that already have received the vaccine, the United States especially have many different mechanisms to what we do is the surveillance of what happens after somebody gets a vaccine. And in this case, including the vaccines for emergency authorization. And on top of it, they created a mechanism. And in fact, I just got my little reminder because I signed up to the active safety monitoring for COVID-19 vaccines. And daily I get a text that says, how do you feel? Did you have these effects? Tell us, were they mild, were they moderate? And all this data is being compiled specifically for these vaccines. Plus, we also have the vaccine adverse event reporting system. We have the clinical immunization safety assessment groups. We even have, the COCA webinars that clinicians and community activity records. And if you even put it in context, and this is a slide that I got from the social media that really tried to make an assessment, because many of you say, well, I'm hearing that, they're really very, I'm going to get some really severe symptoms. The reality is that if you've already gotten other vaccines, especially if you are of the age that you already, for instance, even received the Shingrix vaccine, which is the one against herpes or shingles, right? You pretty much are getting the same spectrum of type of events. And these are transient. You usually get local pain on the site of injection, probably some redness, some swelling. I, for instance, got some headache. I took an Advil afterwards and it went away. Some fatigue, maybe some body aches, some chills, maybe some feverish. But to be quite honest, to date, we have not seen anything that is, of course, overall severe enough that is of concern. So now, again, I do go back to the fact that we now know, and the FDA and many of the advisory body of committees that review the data to approve or authorize these vaccines, we now know that the company, Johnson & Johnson or Janssen Biotech, now do have finished the study sufficiently enough that they have already submitted a docket to the FDA. And in fact, on February 4th, they announced that they will be reviewing and will have committee evaluation, which is in fact actually open to the public if you would like to actually see how the process is done. And on the 26th, they are going to review all the data. The good thing about our US FDA is that when a company gives the data to the FDA, they require to give all the raw data. And what happens is that they don't only review the package of the company, but the FDA also does its own independent review. And then when this VRBPAC committee reviews, they actually review 2 independent assessments, the one that was submitted by the company with all their data and the one that was evaluated by the FDA. And in conjunction, it helps these committees provide a recommendation, and then the ACIP has which is the committee that actually finalizes the immunization practices and how they actually provide the guidance of how the health providers will use the vaccine, the indications, the contraindications, how to actually deliver the vaccine, utilizes the response of the suggestion of the VRBPAC committee, and then the ACIP gives the final instructions, and then the FDA then authorizes. And in this case, probably will also be an emergency authorization. So I'm going to end the presentation so we can start some of Q&A by also reminding you that we certainly have a lot of knowns. And in fact, we probably have a lot more knowns today on how we manage clinically the disease. Ideally, you still do not want to get disease because you don't know how long the repercussions would prevail. We do know that vaccines are effective, and we know that they can prevent disease, and especially severe disease. We know that even in individuals who were previously exposed, the vaccine is quite beneficial because it can actually improve and boost their previously natural exposure and immune response. We certainly know that to date there has been no contraindications, and similar to many other vaccines, individuals with rare genetic diseases are opting to be able to receive these vaccines according, of course, to the priority of the distribution. We do, however, still have quite plenty of unknowns. We still do not know after you get your vaccine how long the protection will last or the duration of the immunity. You have heard that the Pfizer vaccine is authorized 16 years of age and above, the Moderna 18. Most likely Johnson & Johnson will probably also be 18 and above. We don't have any safety and efficacy in children less than 12 years of age. We do know now there are already studies and trials that are going to be looking at the young teenage and certainly eventually even pediatric, even infant. We still have some time for that. We also hear about the new variants, right? And so there's right now many of us developing vaccines. We're of course looking to make sure we are ahead of the curve and look at producing potentially other prototypes. But at the same time, we're already seeing that even if you have a reduction in some protection, we know that any protection right now, it's better than no protection at all. So even if you hear that, well, you know, it was 95, but now it may be low in the 70s or 80s or 60s, 60% protection, 50% protection is super beneficial. And most likely even below, even 30% protection is even way beneficial than getting no protection at all. We're also looking a little bit about the complexities of mixed matching. Like if you already got one vaccine, can you possibly get a booster or even mixed match with other types of vaccines? Again, all of them are targeting pretty much the same spike target. So the key is it allowable to do mix and matching? And of course, scientifically, people are looking at that. And then, of course, again, this whole concept of, you know, we still need to use masks. We need still to do distancing, because until we don't get a lot of people vaccinated, most likely we won't really understand how vaccines are able to stop transmission and spread. So that's why they are now an added tool to bring into the mix, and not necessarily right now still yet to replace any other intervention. So I think I'm going to stop there. I thank you again for your attention. If you're eligible and you're authorized to get a vaccine that is authorized, the benefit really outweighs the risk. Trust the science and the process. Always, of course, talk to your physician. You have to be patient, because albeit with all in all, it's not an easy task. We've never done this recently. We've never done this before with so many people and so much mass of need. And please remain vigilant. Thank you very much.
Dr. Patazzi, thank you so much. That was so informative and a really great overview of where we stand right now. I'm going to quickly transition now to the question slides that I have created. And also, just as a heads up, everyone, I'm going to put it into the chat in a few minutes later. One of my colleagues will. The OIF recently created a new COVID-19 survey. This helps us better understand where our community is at in regards to COVID-19. After the session is done, if you could spend a few minutes to complete that survey, it would greatly benefit us. We would appreciate that. And we're going to be emailing you about that later as well. Let me pull up these slides. Do you guys see this?
Yes.
Okay, let me switch this over.
Oh, you have to change the display. Oh, there you go. Perfect.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to start. We're going to start with some of the questions that we've been getting the most often at the OIF. So the first one is one that we have covered before in previous sessions, but we want to talk about again. Are people with OI considered high risk? Will we be able to get the vaccine sooner? And how do we go about that? And actually, I'm going to hand this off to Dr. Sandhouse first, because I think he is the person who has spoken the most on this.
So I would be happy to answer the first part of the question. We know now that people with OI, regardless of type of OI, have an element of lung abnormality. Fortunately, usually low-grade pulmonary problem, but as most of you know, the major cause of death in OI is not breaking bones, it's a respiratory failure death. And so anyone that has a condition that gives them lung issues should consider themselves to be at higher risk of getting severe disease if they get a COVID infection. How should you handle that fact? The best way to handle it is to follow the usual guidelines for how to protect yourself from developing infection. In addition, of course, to trying to get vaccine, it is masking and social distancing and avoiding crowds and things like that. And when you do that, you definitively will have a higher likelihood of preventing getting that COVID-19 infection, because should you get it, you're probably at higher risk of getting more severe disease. Will we be able to get the vaccine sooner? That, as we often say, is really a function of your state and locality. For many OI patients, it has been sufficient to tell the scheduling person or the scheduling site that you have a condition at high risk. What we're finding is that many vaccine centers and vaccine providers don't require specific documentation of your risk, just your certification that you have a condition of high risk. And so that would be your first approach, would be to simply explain to the scheduling device that's used in your locality that you are considered to be a high-risk individual. Unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't make a difference in terms of where you wind up on the scale of 1A, 1B, 1C2 in terms of vaccine priority, but many, fortunately, it's helped them get their vaccine sooner than they would have otherwise gotten it. And how do you go about that? The thing to know, besides your local health department and your state health department, is that most communities have set up websites and telephone chains that notify people about the availability of vaccines in your area, which site has open spots, which mass vaccination center has slots open and when. So it does take a little work on your part to find those and to figure out how in your community vaccines are being administered. But that work can pay off with getting your vaccine sooner rather than later. And as Maria said, the fact is that, and I'm sure that that Michael's going to mention this, the Medical Advisory Council, which not only includes myself and Brendan Lee and Francis Gloria, who are on this call, met and came out with a strong recommendation that all individuals with OI should get vaccinated.
I would add that one other mechanism, which is to be opportunistic, beyond getting your name on all the lists. There are often directives from the state not to waste vaccine. And I know many individuals, by just monitoring websites for, Walgreens and other, providers that are delivering vaccine, that at the end of the day, slots open up, and it literally is a call. So while that's not very predictable, that is another sort of opportunistic approach to just be alert. Obviously, this favors individuals who are internet savvy, but it is something that is another out there. Just be aware of that.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. So, as both of you have said, this is not a simple, particularly for these last two questions, this is not a simple, clear-cut thing that we can answer. To help those on the call navigate the situation, so the OIF, I just posted into the chat the link to our COVID-19 updates page. on there, we've developed or written a bunch of different resources. So you can read for yourself the Medical Advisory Council statement that Dr. Sandhouse was referencing. You can read that yourself there. It's the very first post, as well as below that is a letter that Dr. Sandhouse wrote for us right after our first vaccine talk, where this is a tool that ideally you could send into your state health department or to your primary care doctor to talk with them about what is your best local strategy for getting on one of these priority groups. Unfortunately, different vocabulary is used state to state, in some cases city to city, so there's no clear-cut answer. But we've posted research linking OI to the link of OI and pulmonary health issues, as well as various strategies there. And I think with that being said, I am going to move on to the next question. So one question that we have been getting a lot, and I'm going to put this in context, is can the shot be given in another part of the body besides the upper arm? So particularly for people with OI, many of whom are wheelchair users, having Dr. Patazzi, you put up that slide of the different more usual effects of the different shots. And one of the highest one was local soreness, but particularly for someone who uses, say, a manual wheelchair, that can actually, disproportionately impact quality of life for a couple of days. And even besides that quality of life issue, there's this other issue around concerns around having low muscle mass in your upper arms. And so we've had different versions of this question about, can you get the actual shot in another part of the body?
Mm-hmm. So maybe I'll start, and then probably I'll ask Dr. Lee, because he actually explained it very nicely when we were kind of chit-chatting in the test trial of this. And the way that these vaccines are delivered are intended to be delivered intramuscularly, right? And so the intent, regardless of where it is that they deliver the vaccine, we have to make sure that indeed it goes intramuscularly. So I am not a physician, but in fact, I posed a question when I went and got mine, and I said, what if somebody would like not to get it on the upper arm? What if I want to get it on my buttocks, or if I want to get it on my leg, right? And indeed, there are special circumstances that if the person requests for a very specific reason, it is considered. But I would like Dr. Lee to explain what exactly means by intramuscular, and therefore the advantage of putting it in another location versus on the arm.
Right, absolutely. So Dr. Patazzi is correct. So the answer is, in fact, you can get it anywhere as long as the shot is into the muscle. And this is important because, as Dr. Patazzi mentioned, the way the vaccine works is the muscle cells have to take up the vaccine and express the spike protein. Now, what are the practical issues? And I think Michael alluded to it. You need to have someone who is experienced in giving an intramuscular vaccine. And it depends on the length of the needle, which is often the case, how much muscle is in the target area, and how much fat is overlying the area. And so the reason why oftentimes in the general population we go into the arm is because the shoulder muscle, the deltoid, is a big muscle, and usually there's very little fat tissue. And the vaccine needles, which are standardized, almost always hit the muscle. So the thing to remember is that if you ask your provider to give the shot somewhere else, like in the thigh or the buttocks, that they have the appropriate needle, they're experienced in giving an intramuscular vaccine there. Many of you who are parents of children, we give intramuscular shots in the buttocks, the gluteal region all the time. But again, pediatric nurses are much more experienced in that and are used to that and have, again, the right size needles. So it really is not an issue of can you get it anywhere. You certainly can get it anywhere as long as you hit muscle. It's really is the provider equipped and experienced in doing so. And so this is why I think Dr. Patazzi also mentioned that when she went to get her vaccine, there was a special section or place with someone who's experienced in doing that and giving those shots. So that's the important thing to remember.
Got it. Thank you. So the next question is about, does size and weight of a person have implications on the dose someone receives? So we've all heard about, or at least for the 2 mRNA vaccinations that are out now in the US, there are 2 shots. Across the board, it's always 2 shots, and it seems independent of weight, size, any of those considerations. People with OI, some of whom are particularly short stature, does this impact your dosing or the shots you receive?
Maybe I can comment.
Yes.
When you get a vaccine, it's very different than when you're getting a dose of, let's say, a drug like a bisphosphonate. Many of you in the audience probably are used to having bisphosphonates, and you have to calculate the dose based on your weight. And that's completely appropriate. Vaccines are a little different because you're not distributing that over the whole body. It's in fact locally deposited in the muscle. And really it's about the cells in your body reacting to it. And so because of that, there really is a one dose that fits all. There are exceptions sometimes in very young children, but at this point, that's not the case. So currently it's really one dose for all individuals.
Maybe I'll just expand that, as you mentioned, Dr. Lee, that sometimes what changes is the volume of injection. Like usually little kids, you tend to give less material than in adults. And it's, again, I think it's a reflection of the fact that they're babies or infants, and that, you don't need to give so much as far as volume goes, but it's not in relation to the body weight or the size. It's just the fact that, certainly it's also because in pediatrics, you may not need the same amount of vaccine as if you need in adults. We've also seen, for example, that in some vaccines for the elderly, also it changes the type of strength of the vaccine. I know some of you ask, the Moderna is 100 microgram, the other one is 80 or 50. Who determines that? And I think it's also the studies and the way that they looked at the data is a reflection of who they studied it in and how they did the schedules as well as the dosages. But it's really not related to the size or the weight of a person.
Great, thank you. So when can we expect a vaccine for children? And do we know anything new about the risks of COVID-19 in children?
So the companies that have vaccines have proposed to study in children starting sometime this spring. The problem with testing in children is that as the prevalence of the virus goes down with successful vaccine programs and things like that, it becomes more and more difficult to enroll children. And many children have asymptomatic infections. So it's a different kind of study that will likely have to be done that includes looking at viral elimination as opposed to clinical outcome. But they've committed to starting studies in children sometime in the late spring, as far as I know, unless you've heard differently, Maria.
No, and in fact, what I was going to highlight is that, remember when I mentioned that the studies that were done up to now, and probably that will continue for the adults, is specifically to reduce the clinical symptoms and the symptomatic disease. And in fact, if the majority, even though not necessarily 100%, because we do have children that do get sick, but probably the way that they design, how they evaluate how well these vaccines will work in pediatrics is indeed what we heard, which is, can we now interrupt not only the potential of having disease, but also reduce the amount of virus and therefore the infection ability of the vaccine to reduce these children to be infected and therefore also transmit.
Thank you. So this next question is about allergies. We've been hearing in the news, they tend to be very sensational stories about adverse reactions to getting vaccinated. On a more specific level, if someone has allergies, should they be concerned about the vaccine? And if so, like, what allergies should we be concerned about?
So, well, I mean, I know from manning some of the vaccine stations that we always ask about allergies as part of the sign up for the vaccine. And in our experience, we've not avoided giving a vaccine unless someone has specifically had a life-threatening severe allergic reaction to a prior type of vaccine. And even then the vaccine can be given, but under those circumstances, we make sure it's given in a hospital. But the incidence of allergic reactions is real, but in general, it's very easily controlled and has not prevented people from getting the vaccines as a generality. I don't know if you've had other experience, Brendan, or.
I think it's important to note that, you know, what we think of as allergies is not a contraindication to getting the vaccine. You know, we get, many of us have common allergies that we take medications for. I think the situation that Dr. Sandoz was referring to is when you have, you know, a severe anaphylactic reaction to a vaccine. That's certainly a situation where you should alert your provider and make sure you're being monitored while you're getting that vaccine. So in almost all cases, when we have allergies, and I have plenty of them, that's not going to be a problem.
And I may just add also that right now, the only contraindication is if the severe allergy that has been encountered before is against one of the components of the current vaccines, which I have to honestly tell you that it's also very rare because the components within the vaccine are very generally safe and accepted and used in many other products. So again, unless you probably had some case of being severely allergic, anaphylactic in a prior, there is absolutely no contraindication.
Excuse me, I just booted myself off of the slides. Okay. So so we've talked about sort of like the more severe things, particularly about concerns around allergies. But now, so you had, again, thinking about that chart you had shown, Dr. Patazzi, what are the common side effects of getting the current vaccines? And are they more pronounced in this first or the second dose? Like, what can we expect when we get it?
Well, maybe I can start and then my colleagues can expand. So first of all, we all react differently, right? You know, there's people who actually get very, very little and almost to nothing. Maybe some sore on the site of the injection and not even anything else. Others indeed may get not only soreness, probably also some redness, you know, headache, fever, body aches. Some people potentially could get even diarrhea or, you know, something a little bit more kind of diseased, right? Clearly, all of them are transient, but the fact that you also have some people that get some, others a little bit more than others, that doesn't necessarily mean that because I didn't get an effect, my body's not responding appropriately to the vaccine. Or that if I did get a lot of reaction, that means that I'm actually getting maybe more immune response. So it's not necessarily equal to your reaction of how your body responds, mounting an immune response to it. True, when you get the first dose, especially, for instance, you were not previously infected by the virus, because remember, if you had been in contact by the virus and then you, of course, get the first dose, you may not be at the same as if you are a person who never encountered the virus and this is the first time that you're seeing this protein spike, right? That's the reason why we also want the 2 doses, because we want everybody to kind of level off and be able to, with the 2 doses is when it was demonstrated that we can really mount a very good immune response and hopefully even most likely long duration. And so the second dose most likely will have a little bit more effects. But again, each of us really are going to have very different levels of side effects.
Yeah, I mean, I can say when I had my second dose, I had more side effects than the first dose. What is clear, as you saw from that elegant table Dr. Patazzi showed, is that with the messenger RNA vaccines, which is the ones that are approved now, they're certainly very common side effects. You should expect them, but again, they are very transient and can be managed generally, quite effectively.
My vaccine doses had very little reaction. And someone asked the question, if I have no reaction, does that mean that my body didn't make antibodies? And the answer to that question very simply is no, that's not what it means.
So there you have it. Three individuals with the whole spectrum of reaction.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what you should expect.
Yeah, and I was kind of middle of the road, so I didn't get as bad as you, Dr. Lee, and probably I still had some, feverish and kind of body ache, but nothing that, the next morning with a nice breakfast and an Advil, it didn't go away.
Got it. That's good to hear. Yeah.
That is a question that people ask a lot because I hear a lot of specific recommendations that have no basis necessarily in fact, that where it's recommended never take Tylenol, Advil, Naproxen for the symptoms you get after the vaccine, and specifically don't take anything prophylactically prior to getting the vaccine. I don't know that there's much evidence to support that. The rationale for things like aspirin, Advil, Aleve is that they are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents, and therefore maybe you would have as good an immune response if they're on board when you get your vaccine. But that's actually a very different kind of inflammation that those are protecting from than the type that leads to antibody production. And Tylenol is not anti-inflammatory. So I'm not sure why these very strong recommendations are coming out. I probably follow whatever your doctor is recommending in terms of these things. But certainly after the vaccine is given, it's better to control the symptoms if they're really severe than it would be to live with them if you weren't able to take those.
Got it. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Okay. Oh, and just as a heads up for those on the call, I noticed that the time right now is we're just about rounding an hour. We will be running a few minutes late. We have a few more questions we want to get to. So do the vaccines all provide the same length of protection? So we hear people talking about booster shots and, we're all getting a little worried about these, variants and future waves and what the heck this next year is going to, even though we're just in 2021, what will 2022 look like? Can you speak on this?
Well, Maria's already answered this question as in the known unknowns section of her talk. And we're all anxious to find out how long vaccine protection lasts. There are two reasons that boosters have come under discussion. One is to boost the immunity that someone already has if that immunity starts to wear off. But there's also the second discussion, which is if a virus mutant emerges that the current vaccines don't cover well, then it's possible that there could be a booster developed that specifically includes some of the coding that the mutant virus has developed to protect itself against virus. There's some arguments why that might not be necessary because it is the attachment to that binding ACE2 receptor is very specific. And if you get a mutant that changes that spike protein too much, it might not be able to bind to the spike protein. But companies are monitoring this very carefully. We've been told by the viral companies, the vaccine companies, that the process of developing a booster for a mutant can be very much shorter than the process that it took to actually develop the initial vaccine. And so if a booster like that is necessary, then vaccine producers are kind of on the ready to develop that if it's necessary. You agree with that, Maria?
I am good with that.
Good.
Great, thank you. So now let's go beyond vaccines. Even though I know this was, so we're moving beyond like what the title of the session is. Are there any new developments in COVID-19 treatments besides vaccines? Because we hear about, like these case numbers are increasing, still, but like, are we getting better once you're, say, in a hospital?
So mortality has gone down for people hospitalized for COVID, thanks to improvements in our understanding of the timing and the type of treatments to be used. There's one thing that we have to specially emphasize, and that is the use of monoclonal antibodies as a treatment for people who have developed COVID-19. They're used in very specific situations. You have to be very close to the time that you became infected and right at the time you start symptoms. You can't be sick enough to be admitted to the hospital. But if you get those monoclonal antibodies, the Regeneron drug and the other company is Lilly that makes the monoclonal antibodies, it can greatly improve your chances of having a very mild disease and not requiring hospitalization. So it's important for people to know that that therapy exists because it takes proactive activity on the part of the person who's infected to notify their healthcare professional that they have developed symptoms of COVID-19 so the therapy can be given at the earliest possible time after symptoms begin.
Great, thank you. And to our knowledge, is there any contraindications for people with OI for those two treatments you just brought up?
No, absolutely not. They're given intravenously.
Okay. So this is our last question of the evening. And I did not write this, although I wish I wrote it. So I have a feeling that most people on this call don't have, like, if they are able to get a vaccine, they will most likely take one very soon. But many of us probably know people in our lives that are more vaccine hesitant than us. So if each of the three of you could each say one thing with the power of influencing one's hesitancy, what would it be?
Well, I can start by saying my one thing, and it is that the unknowing of how sick or even how severe or even the fact that I could die from getting exposed to the virus, it's a risk that I really do not want to take, right? For sure, neither for me nor for my family. So knowing that not only I have, certainly masking, distancing, and hygiene as much as I feasibly can use that, knowing that I can use a vaccine that it's actually been decades that we've been attempting to develop, and we knew how to at least identify the real good target against this virus. That as a scientist, of course, I do know that the processes that went through with developing them. Any vaccine that is authorized, it's way beneficial. And that's the only way that it's going to bring in the disruption of this pandemic to the world.
I'll go next. I think that there are many reasons for hesitancy. The one reason that many reasonable people have is that something is new and we don't have clinical experience with it, and therefore they want to wait and see what happens with the vaccine. As Maria pointed out, we've already around the world vaccinated probably nearly 100 million people with these vaccines and various vaccines. And so the safety and the benefit of it has now been pretty well established. I think it's very difficult sometimes for people to understand that even if a therapy can promote harm in a small percentage of the people who receive it, the benefits greatly outweigh the risks. We all take medications that have side effects, and some of them could be potentially serious, but the benefits we now know greatly outweigh any risks of even the milder side effects. So I think that there's also the hesitancy that has to do with various populations within the country. Black individuals have been historically treated poorly by the medical establishment, and experimentation has been done in that community that was absolutely horrendous. And so for generations, there's a hesitancy about modern medicine within Latino and Black communities. And that hesitancy can only be overcome by having vaccines be used in that community so that individuals who are vaccinated can tell their community, can inform them about the safety. Nothing necessarily that I could say would be as convincing as what could be done within that community, and efforts really need to be made to increase the vaccination rate in that community.
So maybe what I'll say is, that you've heard a lot about this issue of risk versus benefit, and we deal with that every day when we cross the street and we participate in research. And I always short circuit the discussion, and I learned this from my mentors and my teachers, and I tell this to all my patients. You have to read everything and digest it, and that's why you're here today. But at the end of the day, I just answer a very simple question. Would I do it to myself, my child, my mother, my father, my wife, my whoever? And if the answer is yes, then I have no problems telling my patient or my, research participant that you should do it. And frankly, with this whole situation with the vaccines, that's the answer. We should all do it.
One other thing I'd say is that I've experienced that young people, teenagers, people in their 20s, 30s, have a sense that this virus does not affect them in a major way. It is true that more severe disease occurs in people that are older and have concomitant medical conditions. They're more likely to have severe disease, they're more likely to die. But the vaccine is not only to protect yourself, it's to protect your whole community.
Great. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. So just as a quick reminder to those on the call, we have posted both the survey that the OIF created around COVID-19. If you could take a few minutes to complete that, we would appreciate it greatly. Also, we have a whole host of resources that we've created around COVID-19, links to your state's health department, a sample letter that Dr. Sandhouse wrote around advocating for priority vaccination, as well as links to his research articles on pulmonary health and OI, and a whole bunch of other things. Please go check that out. And if you have any questions, feel free to email us at bonelink@oif.org, or you can go to our website, oif.org. Thank you so much. Please keep washing your hands. Now wear 2 face masks, not 1. And right, that's like brand new. And thank you so much. We appreciate you being here with us tonight.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Good night.
Thank you very much.